Very, very welcome to this webinar, the pandemic and the energy crisis, and what those crises can teach us in reversing overconsumption. And very welcome to all of you attendees. I don't know if I can see everyone, but very welcome, and very welcome to the speakers. We'll have both perspectives from the pandemic, from the current energy crisis, and also perspectives from business as well as politics on those crises. My name is Anna. I'm from New Weather, Sweden. Very happy to be able to host this together with the Rapid Transition Alliance, who has been working a lot on the theme of the pandemic and lessons from the pandemic, making briefings, films, and I think Andrew Sims can tell us more about that in a minute or so. I see that Freddie is writing in the Q&A chat. Yes, please feel free to introduce yourselves there. And Freddie will help us with technical issues, which is really good. So you can also write questions in the Q&A while the speakers are speaking. Now we have Nick joining. Yippee, wonderful. So we're recording this. I hope this is okay for you, everyone. And what more do we need to say? We'll have lots of space for discussion and questions in the end of the webinar. Hopefully also some questions after each speaker. We'll see how much time you take for speaking. Andrew, would you like to start? Andrew Sims from the Rapid Transition Alliance. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Anna. I will, and I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of some of the observations that we made about some of the possibilities of change behavior patterns around consumption that were revealed by the experience of the pandemic. And it feels like a slightly odd time at which to do it, because in the current economic climate, a lot of governments are reverting back to looking for strategies to promote straightforward, old-fashioned growth, which basically means growth in consumption. But we know, because of the challenge of meeting the climate and ecological crisis, that especially in high-income countries and among high-income groups, that we need to see some radical reductions in consumption. So the examples I'm going to be just speaking through very, very quickly are just giving a kind of a hint of our revealed agency for changing behavior. We also think that sitting behind this is a huge literature that tells us that if you can get off the consumer treadmill and we can rearrange our lives around more sufficiency, then there are huge well-being and health gains to be made, as well as environmental and ecological gains to be made. But one of the hardest things to do is to try and imagine a life without the culture of consumerism, because we've been living within it in wealthier countries for more than half a century. And it's something that we often sort of say at the Rapid Transition Alliance, that it's been almost easier to imagine the end of the world, and it has a fundamentally different economic system and fundamentally different lifestyles than those that we currently have in wealthy societies. And the Rapid Transition Alliance was set up to look at evidence of our ability to change at speed and scale to meet what the climate science tells us is necessary. But shortly, not that long after we set up to do that, we found ourselves living through just such an example of a disruption to our lives, which was making us adapt in a whole range of different ways. And the experience of the last few years has thrown up certain interesting terms with regards to the subject that we're discussing today. People have talked about there being a quarantine of consumption, about habit discontinuity events, language around post-traumatic growth and behavior spillover effects, all things which will come out in some of these examples. So let's just quickly look at a few. Now, for one thing that we discovered, that during the height of lockdown, and I know it was different in different countries, that people got very good at entertaining themselves. While all the but the shops that sold essential goods were closed, and shopping as a sort of a leisure activity, as it is promoted, was put on hold. The pandemic seemed to unlock our abilities to entertain each other, and it brought people together over everything from jigsaws to singing to playing chess and learning the ukulele. Now, you might think that dance is an activity that is a very difficult thing to do under lockdown, and it demanded certainly very high levels of ingenuity. But there were online dance classes turning living room floors into dance floors. There were students keeping fit with online classes and by dancing at home and in gardens and bedrooms. The Dutch National Ballet made an at-home ballet to connect people and keep the love of dance alive. So this kind of general keep fit at home really flourished as well. But there was also, surprisingly, given that a lot of people were experimenting with the technology for the first time, even choirs found that by convening online, where time delays and dodgy connections don't make this sort of thing very easy, really improved people's sense of well-being and created a sense of kind of virtual community that encouraged creative co-production and co-creation. There was an explosion also of public art during the time, when being able to walk in the open air and in green spaces was one of the few activities available. I mean, I just noticed in my immediate environment, I live in London, which is kind of very heavily traffic congested, but with the traffic levels going down, there was a visible increase in children doing old-fashioned things like doing chalk art on pavements as cars were left in garages. And in our local parks, there were tree decorations and more. Some of our leading artists created art clubs that really brought people together, not just to make art, but to reflect on the experience and the upheaval, the traumatic experience of the pandemic. And it gave voice and access to thousands of people, gave them permission to find satisfaction in a meaningful creative activity. Another one of our leading, that was Grayson Perry is one of our leading artists, and he did an art club on TV like that. Another one, Anthony Gormley, created a thing called the Great Big Art Exhibition that encouraged people to turn the windows at the front of their houses into little galleries, and you could walk around and see people sharing art, which not only kind of transformed local atmospheres, but also brought communities together in a difficult moment. So it shows that when there are restrictions and limits, and when we're talking about planetary boundaries and living within them, these are sort of implicit in everything. It's not necessarily something which is going to suppress our creativity, rather than actually give rein to it, give it a different kind of expression. That in fact, creativity loves certain parameters to work with and against. We see that in music, we see that in art, we see that in theatre. And people were learning to use their hands again quite a lot. People were, there was one of the great phenomenon, certainly in the UK, was people realizing that their homes have become overstuffed with stuff. And there were big clear outs, people taking things to charity shops, and people wanting to simplify their lives. Many people deciding that they wanted kind of to buy fewer, but maybe higher quality things, which can stand the test of time. But there was an outbreak of people getting involved in mending things and repairing things. The classics of the green economy, sort of mend, repair, care and maintenance. In the UK during our first lockdown, spending on the equipment that you use for sort of doing up your own home went up by over 20%. There was an increase in the sale of sewing machines by about 127%. People were finding time to repair their clothes. And a lot of retailers saw a sort of a surge in the raw materials for making our own stuff, like sale to fabric, etc., etc. And there was obviously also a concomitant drop in the amount of fast fashion sales, with a lot of, this is where that expression, the quarantine of consumption, came in. There were big drops pretty much across the board there, with many people saying they're going to be much more likely to buy secondhand as well, rather than buying new stuff in future. But it wasn't just in our clothing, it was in the kitchen as well. There was a great sort of relocalization as people got back into cooking their own stuff. And generally speaking, when you cook your own stuff, rather than buying ready prepared things or eating in restaurants, there is much less waste. And this is indeed what we're seeing. And we know this is a huge problem, because rotting food in a landfill accounts for possibly around about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is only slightly less than the amount of emissions created by road transport. So it's a huge issue. And we saw in many different places, even in places where the pandemic hit really hard, like Italy early on in the first wave of the virus, food waste fell despite increases in the purchase of food. And we saw similar things echoed in Germany and the UK and elsewhere. It became almost a kind of cliche at the height of the first lockdown, people experimenting with baking their own bread and showing their loaves of sourdough on Instagram. It's easy to make fun of, but it's actually, for a lot of people, it was a profound reconnection with food and making food and a reskilling in the kitchen, which is also a big part of the kind of transition process that we need to go through. And there were changes in patterns of eating too, with a real rise, I suppose, perhaps because partly people were being very health conscious, a shift towards vegetarianism and veganism, and that came through in the statistics. But there were changes in behavior too, and some of the things which were quite interesting, and this is where another one of those phrases, post-traumatic growth, comes in, people reconsidering things, but also people being incredibly mindful, because we know that the levels of compliance with requests to change behavior to respect other people's health needs were higher than a lot of governments were expecting. There was a lot of compliance, demonstrating that we can change our behavior virtually overnight. We saw the growth of mutual aid groups in the UK in the first throes of lockdown. Over 4,000 mutual aid groups in a recent study showed that over 40% of those were still active. So a reweaving of community, again, a key thing about resilience and communities in the face of the transition that we need to make. So that was a fascinating dynamic. And that also came through in the way in which people appreciated access to green space, found it important, and how it revealed some of the inequalities in access to green space. So the ethnic minorities and people at the lower end of the income group are more likely to be living in places with less green space and places which are more polluted. But people were voting with their feet and getting out and getting into the green space, especially in highly urbanized societies from the UK to Hong Kong and Norway. People were also finding 1 minute. I'll wrap up really quickly. People were innovating, finding spaces like avenues of trees and on main boulevards where there was less traffic, people were meeting up. So there was a different kind of streetscape. So I'll just kind of finish really by saying that whenever one talks about this issue, the old cliche about the green movement is about leading a more dull and minimal life. But I think the experience of just looking at this one particular example showed actually an explosion of creativity and innovation and things which we know from the research punch through into increasing our levels of well-being and demonstrating that in a very short period of time, we can change our behaviors to lower consumption and raise well-being. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So many inspiring examples and yeah, thrilling. It's also, I mean, so much has happened since the pandemic. So like when you asked us to be part of this project, both me and my colleague Gunnar were like, but the pandemic, isn't that quite a while ago? And you were like, no. So, but still, I mean, there's been a period and lots of things have happened since, but just short reflections. Why do we still need to look upon what happened during the pandemic? What do you think, Andrew?
I think the biggest issue is that as people kind of rush to get back to normal and quite understandably want to reach for the familiar, there's a danger, of course, that we have very short memories. And when we get back into the political discussion about the challenges facing us, that it's a question of what kind of proposals are deemed to be politically possible, politically achievable. And the greatest difficulty people often have in terms of thinking about changing behaviors is being able to imagine it. I cannot be what I cannot see. But if we can hold in view the changes that we achieved so rapidly and so radically, literally yesterday or in the last few months, it indicates to us the agency and the ability that we do have. In fact, far from us being like, to use an old English expression, old dogs that can't learn new tricks. Actually, we're brilliant at adapting at speed and at scale. And that's in terms of everything from our infrastructure through to our technological adaptations. We haven't had time to go into that today. But most importantly, and this is often the one which people tiptoe around because they're afraid of sending out frightening political messages, in terms of our behaviors. We can change our behaviors for the better and in respect of the looking after and caring for others and society more broadly, almost overnight.
Thanks, Andrew. Then I will say welcome to Nick Meynen, who's author of the book Turning Point, The Pandemic as an Opportunity for Change. A very good title for this webinar. And
Thank you.
Welcome. You're also the Senior Policy Officer for Systemic Change at the European Environmental Bureau.
Entirely correct.
Very welcome. And you also wanted to start off with the film, and I think, shall we start off with that one just immediately? Then
yeah, it sets the tone. It's a 2-minute clip, which is like a trailer,
yeah,
and then I can talk a bit more. Yeah.
Here it comes.
You were once invincible. The dream of a man-made future was clouding your view. Couldn't stop yourself from tugging at the sky, nearly ripping her ozone in two. The heavenly blue has now become a weathered doormat that used to say, "Welcome." How much of paradise did you leave untouched? Was there anywhere left for me to hide from your clutches when even the last remote wilderness is smudged and you expect no repercussions? You woke me from my slumber with your greedy hands, spoiled like a child. You kept screaming demands. More meat and fish, more coffee and spice, more cars and gadgets, and I want to go higher. You just took what you wanted without asking nice and forced your way into my empire. An eye for an eye, and now you require a mask to go shopping for all you desire. You thought you were invincible, and now you think that I locked you down inside your houses, that I cast you into the prison cells that were once your castles, just to cause you pain. You thought you were invincible, maybe again. Only in a sleeping bat, waking up humanity to its vicious cycle of greed. I may be the virus, yes, that I caused the disease. If it takes a virus to raise a child, what more would it take for you to seize the opportunity to change your beliefs?
Well, the sound quality was not ideal, but you can always watch it again on Twitter or YouTube, and you get the idea, I think. So yeah, that's basically what I did with the Turning Point publication, is to look at the deeper story behind the pandemic and what it exposes, what it tells us about the story of humanity in general. It didn't arrive on a blank sheet. It arrived on a humanity which was already in crisis. So my story is a bit different from Andrew, which I appreciated a lot. I'm going to lose the competition of who was the most upbeat and positive on this panel, because I mean, I agree with your increase of well-being and the need to imagine this world that we all crave for, this thriving of people and planet in harmony. But to get there, I delved deep into the state of play of our crisis, and then the journey of this virus, how this journey of this virus exposes our various systemic weaknesses in our society. And then from there, and from this deeper understanding, then looking at 10 ways that the bigger lessons that we could be learning if we were to have an ambitious response to what just happened to all of us. And as we all know, this was the latest, but probably not the last pandemic, given the situation. So without further ado, I have just a few slides. Should I share my screen, Anna? Yes, or?
If I think you can,
yes.
I think the settings are made so that you can do it.
Yes. Let me just, can you already see something? No, I guess not, huh? Not yet. Let me just share screen on the right one. So many tabs open. There you go.
I know.
Yes, I have it. I have it.
Okay.
There you go. And just need to go to the start. Sorry, I was a bit unprepared and late to the meeting because of complications at the office. Somebody took my bag with my computer. Anyway, So history is a series of shocks. I think it's not a gradual process, and pandemic was one of these shocks, and that brings us to a turning point, whether we like it or not. So in just a few minutes, can you see it now? Yeah, okay. So this shows very good the state of play of humanity, I think. It's an exposition in Paris on the great acceleration, a peer-reviewed scientific article that goes out there for a long time. And it shows trends of major indicators of humanity for the last 250 years. And this whole exhibition was about this one article. And on this picture, you can see like what are the majorly trends in humanity. And there is a pattern here. You see that we have gradually rising curves until at some point they become exponentially rising. And these show things like population on the 4 is the least of the exponential problems that we have. Then GDP, but then things like water use, fertilizer use, and the black line at the end is international travel movements, for which I think they had to increase the roof a bit of the of the exhibition. So this is a pattern here where we have exponentially rising curves, while before we had gradually rising curves. And thanks to the pandemic, everyone in society now knows there is a difference between these two, and that the exponentially rising ones are really problematic. That's when things get out of control. However, we haven't reacted in the same urgency as towards the great acceleration as we did with the pandemic. And this, of course, has a lot of detail. I'm not going to go into it, but it's a pattern everywhere. And let me just take one example. The most famous one is climate change. But it's just one of many indicators. And here you see the best available data in the world on the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's not the bookkeeping of governments, what they are telling us, how they are reducing. This is actual measurements, data from the atmosphere. And I indicated a bit the COP1 to COP26 of the last 26 years of our negotiations on climate. So I see Andrew nodding like, yeah, it's definitely less positive and upbeat as you were talking about, because the net effect in the atmosphere is still yet to be found from all the efforts of humanity so far. And of course, there are various explanations for this, but it has been discussed also by you, I think, Andrew, that there is an issue of highly inequality. And this is a graph from Oxfam that shows this, where you have the richest being responsible for far, far more of the impacts of these greenhouse gas emissions than the poorest. And the share of the high income class of greenhouse gas emissions is even rising. So there is really a problem with just saying that we are causing climate change. When you hear we always have to think, well, who exactly do you mean? There is really massive diversion of we in the culprit side. And on the victim side, there is also a massive difference. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are the environmental defenders that are killed on the front lines all over the world for trying to defend some projects of mass mining, a mega dam, or a big plantation being forced upon them against their will, and they are trying to protect their community and get killed for that. And this is, again, just the tip of the iceberg. There is a trend on that, not just in the killings, also in the harassments, in the violence in general against activists who are trying to defend what we still have. So that was the state of play before the pandemic arrived. And then when the virus came out of the jungle to humanity, I just have a few slides on that, following in the footsteps of the journey. So, okay, so it starts in some tropical rainforests from some animals, and it jumps from animals to humans, somewhere in China probably, but not even sure. And if you look at other pandemics, so often these zoonotic exchanges from animal to human, where do they take place? Well, they take place a lot at the sites of mining, at the sites of cutting trees, at the sites of where humanity invades in a certain natural biotope where humanity maybe shouldn't be. And these levels of interactions at the edges of the last pristine parts of nature, they are definitely increasing. And so the chances of these viruses flipping from animal to human is increasing. And the search for scapegoats reflects that in the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people pointed fingers to the poor indigenous gatherer hunter people who occasionally have to kill and eat a civet cat or something to survive, while actually the whole wildlife trade is an international business which is driven mostly by rich consuming people in the global north, who are putting pressure on ecosystems in the global south because of wildlife consumption. So it is not the indigenous people who do the same thing for the last 3,000 years who are behind the increase in interactions with wildlife that carries viruses. What happened next with the virus? It is also clear, like, well, cruises, they were perfect petri dishes. I mean, in the beginning, you had the John Hopkins tracker. I don't know if you remember. You had all these countries like, oh, 500 cases in China, 300 in Japan, 600 in Diamond Princess. Which country is Diamond Princess? That was just a cruise ship. And they added it to the list of countries because that was like on second place or something. And they are perfect environments for these viruses to spread. And we took a political decision as humans to keep those who are infected on such a boat, spreading it further from there. And then we have to ask questions about the shipping industry and specifically cruise ships in particular. Who is benefiting from them? What are their costs, even before the pandemic, to water, to air, to the use of fossil fuels, to slavery, to the 100,000 people stuck on cruise ships months into the pandemic? They didn't get their passports back. All of these issues, they were there. And then on top of that, the cost to society of these cruise ships, which benefit a small percentage of the income class of people, are accelerating pandemics. So are they even worth having? The questions maybe need to be asked around that. Then what happens next? Aside from the cruise ships, you have the planes, of course. The number of planes crisscrossing our skies is, of course, making it much easier for this virus to spread than previous viruses. So we are more vulnerable because of the amount of air traffic. That's what the pandemic shows us. We are more vulnerable and we need to be more resilient. But what happens next?
One minute, Nick. 1 minute.
Oh. Okay, so when it arrives, the pandemic, the virus, it finds us bleeding Bambi deer who are wounded already by bad air quality. Our lungs are wounded, and this is a new predator, so it makes it easier for the new predator to cause damage. It also is clear that all the chemicals in our environment are lowering our immune system's response to a new virus. So again, questions need to be asked about the cost of having all these chemicals. Then I have a whole chapter on how, the neoliberal normal of crisscrossing goods across the globe is also making it easier for a virus to spread. And then I have some words on the machos behind the mass graves, which leads me to an eco-feminist perspective on the whole crisis, because the women leaders have reacted a lot better. And that leads me to the last slide, which are like some of the bigger lessons that we can learn, what this debate is all about. So I wanted to get to this one. I think there is a lot to learn on the food supply. We are very vulnerable in it. We've seen countries saying no to exports of grain and rice and so forth. And there is indeed, as Andrew said, a lot of action in the society of people wanting to source locally, cook themselves again. So there is a potential to grow on the new routes for the food system. Meat, industrial meat has been a hotbed for the pandemic spread as well. Again, questions need to be asked. Mobility, again, air traffic. There are so many movements out there who try to formulate alternatives for our movements, our patterns of tourism and so forth. We are making demands on mining, how to keep it in the ground, because once it's out there, the problem is already there. And well, I have a lot more, but we can maybe get to that later in the debate so that I don't run too much over time. That's some reading list at the end. And I'll stop there. Hope that was not too long.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Just one very short question. You wrote this book more as a thought piece and not as a report. What was the thought? What were the thoughts behind that?
Well, that in the EEB, that's not a natural publication to make. Our tendency, our bread and butter is specific reactive policy positions towards specific policy files on the table, and then create amendments and reactions. And that, while that's all good and well, we need that. I mean, the evidence is out there that incremental changes only are not going to be enough. So that's why on top of them, we have to have a discussion on the deeper changes. And it is also not enough to say, yeah, we'll do that later when the time is there. First, we need to do A, B, or C. We've been saying that for decades, and that's why we get in an ever bigger mess. So we have to speak now about the bigger things that we could change, even if they're not yet at the political discussion in the EU at the parliament. Because it's indeed like Andrew said, like, can we still imagine the change that we need? And for me, the focus was not on the consumer level of the change that we can imagine, rather on the policy and the production and the extraction level. can we imagine organizing our economies in a radically different way? And actually, a lot is possible. Just look at the pandemic, what it's trying to teach us. And that's what the whole publication was about.
Thank you. I think we can come back to that. It's a really important issue.
Yes.
And then welcome Verena Becks from Can Europe, and you're the Energy Savings Policy Coordinator. And we're very, very pleased to have you here, especially since you have perspectives on a current crisis that can broaden and enrich our discussion. So welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. I will also share my screen, but I just have a very few slides. I am okay. So I have the screen sharing, and then I will probably not be able to see you anymore. Oh, I am. Great. Perfect. So yes, I will talk about the current energy crisis, which I think links well with the last crisis. I will also talk a bit about the COVID effects on the energy consumption, and let's maybe dig right into it. Why we're even talking about energy savings, which has really been a topic that has been coming up quite strongly in the past weeks, especially looking at what has been thought about in terms of how to prepare for next winter, and also in connection with the war in Ukraine. We think that the war in Ukraine has really, and that's also something that the Commission has underlined several times, that the really revealed Europe's dependency on energy inputs, but especially on fossil fuels. And the energy price crisis is a crisis that links with gas prices. Ultimately, we can say it has to do with fossil fuels. And when we talk about energy savings, like, for example, buildings renovations, heat pumps, triple glazed windows, they were rarely the talk of the town in the past, let's say. And now everyone's talking about energy savings. So this energy savings measures are really central now. And that is something that has been shown in the past months to get free from Russian fossil fuel dependency. So why energy savings? They, of course, lead to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. There was a report from the IEA that energy efficiency delivers more than 40% of the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions emission cuts to achieve the international climate goals, which is quite a lot. And then it, of course, leads to improved health, also due to reduced air pollution. And we can see quite some considerable effects of energy efficiency measures, for example, to reduce also energy poverty. When we look at, especially with regards to buildings, and the link to energy security is something that has been highlighted in the past a lot now. So what Timmermans said just last week was that energy is really the cheapest, not using energy is really the cheapest energy now. I think he has said that several times. This is really the reason why we're engaging in energy savings as such. And we've seen that until now, not much progress has been made. We need to be aware that to be able to fulfill the Paris Agreement goals, we need to considerably reduce our energy consumption within this decade. So I have brought you a small graph on this, where we are now, where we need to go by 2030, just looking at the current targets that are on the table. As you all know, last week we have seen the new State of the Energy Union report, which says that we have reached the 2020 targets. for energy efficiency. This is of course true, but we also need to look at the reasons for it. And if we would have taken stock just before 2020 in 2019, we would have missed the energy efficiency targets, which are in the end also savings targets. So all measures, not only energy efficiency, will be counted towards those targets, just to be clear about it. So what is quite striking are the COVID years, because the measures that were adopted in response to COVID led to the largest drop in energy consumption in recent history. And the final energy consumption really dropped drastically between 2019 and 2020. And when we compare it to 1990, which was the earliest year for which data was available, the absolute level of final energy consumption was lowest. So I think so the COVID crisis really could in some way teach us what is possible in terms of reducing energy consumption. Well, I'm also quite curious to see what will happen with regards to our energy consumption in the next winter, because measures that are being adopted right now with regards to Repower EU, the EU Safe Energy Safeguards for Safe Winter plans, everything that has been put out by the commissions and some things that were also adopted by member states really propose a lot of measures to reduce gas and especially, and yeah, so I think that will be quite an example to see what will be happening now in terms of more structural reduction, but at the same time short term. So I think this is important to say. Most of the measures that were that are now being proposed and are being picked up are behavioral demand campaigns, relying on goodwill, reduction of temperature, and what we are looking at is of course also the mid and long-term energy savings. For example, the increased energy efficiency target to at least 13% that was proposed by the Commission, and other suggestions like increasing the level of the energy savings obligation, stronger minimum energy performance standards for buildings, etc. So there were quite a range of measures and regulatory changes that were being proposed within Repower EU and everything that followed after the war in Ukraine. So there are a lot of opportunities in the response to the current energy price crisis, also in terms of the 15% reduction target in energy consumption and the binding target of 5% reduction in electricity consumption is something that is quite interesting in terms of that it will actually lower the energy consumption of member states. When we look at the national efforts, we see that currently it's quite a patchwork approach that is being rolled out, because many member states, of course, decide for themselves what kind of plans they propose and how loose or how binding these are. For example, France was heavily criticized for their non-binding measures, including turning off lights, lowering thermostat temperature, and Spain, for example, came up with quite a package for energy contingency to cut national gas consumption.
You have one minute, Verena.
Oh yeah, it's very short, but I will succeed to jump then over to the next slides. So overall, we think that this winter can really and hopefully show us some best practice examples that can lead the way to long-term energy savings measures. So ideally, the measures that are being adopted now are already long-term energy savings measures. Coming to the conclusion, I think what we need to look at is to really, well, we have an energy price crisis. At the same time, we have a climate emergency. That means we need to stick to the Paris Agreement goal. We need a higher binding energy efficiency target that is in line with the Paris Agreement. And we need, of course, strong governance behind it and a strong energy savings obligation. We also need to look at, of course, at buildings, and the minimum energy performance standards are very important in this regard. And we need to really increase the depth of renovation. And we need to look at eco-design measures, which bring a big bulk of energy savings. To look at sustainable products being the norm. Eco-design ban on sales of gas boilers is something that is currently debated. So what is needed now is, political will to prioritize energy savings also beyond the next winter, following winters, and let's say high prices are probably here to stay. So far, the progress was really low to make a difference, and we really need to speed up with everything that we're doing already, including the rate of building renovation, phasing out of fossil fuel-based heating systems, circular economy approaches, the transport shift, and I think the current energy crisis can really hopefully teach us a lot how to put this on the agenda of politicians. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Verena. One short question. Many of these measures that are now being put forward is, at least what I can see, that mainly the main argument is the energy prices crisis and not mainly climate. So how do you look upon that? Is that a possibility or a problem or both?
I think everything that helps us to put this on the agenda to ultimately also solve the climate emergency is helpful. So I think the energy security angle was a long time now overlooked, even though we of course knew it has an impact. And I would say it helps the debate, at least looking at what is being proposed for now. We of course need to see how this will develop.
Thank you so much. So valuable to get your perspectives. It gives a very broad and wide picture with all of you. So thank you so much. And we'll come back to you, of course. And then I say welcome to Katarina Björk, who's both the chair of the green think tank Cogito maybe, and also working at Doconomy. And you had such a long title, Applied Concept Strategy Manager, Doconomy. Welcome, and you're going to give us some perspectives from business.
Yeah, I will try. I will do my best. As I have a bit of a hybrid background and experience, I tend to watch both trends in business and politics and see what can come out of this. Can you see my screen now? Is it okay? Or am I showing everything that I shouldn't? Good. So I would say that these are reflections from during the pandemic, or before and during the pandemic and after, and where we are now. And I told Anna when we started the conversation about this seminar, we were somewhere completely different, and the outlook for business and organization has changed a lot since then, and might do in the coming weeks as well. So just a glance through things that I think about and look at. Just to give you a background, I tend to go back to World Economic Forum's risk report, which they launch every January, because it's quite interesting to see what are they looking at and what are respondents in business looking at as high likelihood to happen or high or low, and what kind of impact it would have on business. And it's specifically on business. So you have the impact on the y-axis and likelihood to happen on the x-axis. And this was from 2020, January 2020. Right outside the glass, we have infectious diseases right to the left. And a few months after, or just weeks after, we had the pandemic hitting us. So I find it quite interesting to have this and discuss it with different actors from everywhere, together with all other insight you might have, to see how can we prepare, what strategies do we have, what kind of scenarios do we have looking ahead. Looking back at the pandemic, I saw disrupted supply chains. Suddenly, you couldn't get what you needed to deliver your product, or if it was food, or if it was semiconductors or whatever. So that brought out from business very much, okay, so we did have just-in-time principle. Maybe that didn't work. We need to have something else. We need to refocus, and that showed also not only in business but also in security in society. Oh, we used to have things for healthcare and hospitals, but we don't, because we're so used to have it at once when we will need it. And suddenly, I think with that, to some extent, an insight for many people in business and politics and everywhere got, okay, there is an ecosystem and we're connected in many ways, and we didn't really know all of them. And now we know, or maybe have some of them uncovered, and we need to rethink. We maybe need to relocalize, keep what we need closer, or rethink our talent or whatever. We also had an exponential increase in digitalization. First, we got a shock, and then grocery stores and others, ukulele teachers came about the idea that, oh, we can do this digitally. Actually, my son started to play ukulele, and we had also a lot of dancing session at home with live DJs, really, really good DJs, wherever they were in their home. So, I mean, it was both in terms of culture, but also in terms of how do we provide services, good or bad, because this increased e-commerce a lot, but also made very good services providable, for example, for elderly or forever, for anyone who needed it. So it's, I think in all these aspects, there is both good and bad. There are parallel developments, if you will. We could see that there was an increased digital reporting from some nations, very good to keep track on COVID. On the other hand, it led to a possibility of surveillance of individuals and citizens that is still going on. I could also see after the first risk and shock that businesses started to see, okay, we need to collaborate. We need to find other partners than we used to, which opens up also for something that you, Verena, mentioned, for circular business models that often needs collaboration between actors that usually don't play together and usually don't play in that way together. So they could actually see, okay, so we need to open our eyes, see beyond our silos and work in some other model. And we don't know how that is. And that requires another type of leadership. So I would say that increased, it hasn't really happened yet, but it's bubbling anyway. And we can see that urgency. With urgency comes imaginations and creativity, as you say, Andrew. Suddenly you could actually raise a question or an opportunity that like 2 months ago was utopia. And now it was actually, yeah, maybe that is an opportunity that we should explore in boardrooms or in C-level meeting rooms, and to actually think beyond, for example, flights. Maybe we don't, we're not in the flight business. We might be in some other business that is not that energy or fossil fuel intense, for example. So I think, as many of you have said, that we show that we have an ability both to imagine new solutions, to see what is valuable for human being, and to make the decisions and change, and do it quite fastly, and learn from each other. Cities created connections to learn from each other. How do we handle the pandemic? I think I spend too much time on this, but anyway, you keep track of me, Anna. So that is a bit on the pandemic, and I think much of the opportunities that came with it, but also some quite disturbing and disrupting tensions that we also have in parallel going on at the same time. Looking at business, I sometimes use this picture. So what is important for a business to take care of? The clients, their customers, their products, their markets, their brand. It's very important to manage risks. It's very important to manage resources. So we touched upon these very much. And I think it started with taking care of risk and survival and see what do we get, and then to discover new opportunities, new ways of staying and being there. I also think that these areas are the ones that there are most value in if you want to go towards a sustainable business model. That's where you find the most important, both when it comes to efficiency, using resources or raw materials, but also where you actually find where to make a business. Just an illustration of what I just said, that a consequence that many wants to change their consumption behaviors, but also that the supply chain doesn't work at all and still doesn't. And then going a couple of years after World Economic Forum, there are 10 most severe risks on global scale for the coming 10 years. It's worth a look for business. How do we avoid this? How can we prepare to be a part of the solution in all these? With climate action failure as the first one. And again, lots of businesses have this in their strategies. Most of them don't take them into account to that extent that they should. But anyway, I think there is
one minute, Katarina.
Thank you. And increased awareness anyhow, and that we can see that in new exploration when it comes to business models, but we can still also see the exact opposite, that we have a huge increase in private jets after the pandemic. So it's like we have both ends. So looking at the crisis right now, I think it still affects many of the same areas in businesses, with right now, with the energy crisis, with the geopolitical tensions and the war, and also with inflation and recession. There's a focus on resource efficiency, on risks, and human resources. And what I hope is that we can, and what we also see is that in that, as you said, Verena, it's also, we have a linkage to the decarbonization strategies, to the circular models, to resource efficiency that might lead to more sustainable consumption, if you will. So that is my hope. Let's see where we go. We also have the parallel going on. But I try to be optimistic and highlight the good things. Thank you.
Thank you. Really fascinating. And if we stick on to the positive trends, or it's a big question, but do you have any like short reflections on what is the most urgent things to do to reinforce the positive trends that you can see?
I think, I mean, when it comes to business, if we look at the large business, there is like a spiral between regulatory frameworks and then business take the next leap, at least in Europe, maybe not everywhere. So I think at the moment, at least in Sweden, we see a backlash when it comes to politics. I hope that business, and we can see locally and regionally, that business is still it's alive. They want politics to progress and take a larger leap. And I hope that we both as individuals and NGOs or wherever we are based push both those actors to progress. I think also that the regulatory frameworks that are coming will create opportunities for business. But then I see that's also a European thing. I see that it's quite important that we get US on board, which they are to some extent, but also there are still, I mean, we have both ends. So I think it's also important to highlight those positive examples, especially when we're towards a recession and downturn, and people tend to be a bit more narrow-minded. So it's.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. And then I say welcome to Eva Svedling, who will give us some political perspectives on these issues. And you were state secretary in the Swedish government at the Ministry of Environment, that will no longer exist soon. And you also, you had this position during the pandemic. So I guess you have many reflections from within the political system. Thank you, and you're welcome to just take your place.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for very interesting reflections. I fear that I will be the one pointing out the negative and maybe being a bit pessimistic when it comes to, I mean, I think we need to separate the long-term effects and consequences and possibilities from the short-term possibilities and what we see and what we wish for. So, but I will try to get you to give you some reflections from inside politics. I was a state secretary, as Anna said, between 2016 and 2021. The first reflection that came to my head is that in general, when it comes to crisis, we tend to wanting to go back to normal, in opposition to what Andrew and Nick actually said. But that's what I experienced, and that's what I heard and saw as reactions, and being also very reactive, and in the way we have constructed our society that made that was also a very destructive reaction to what actually happened, because normal is destroying our common home and our common, the only planet we have. But I will get back to at the end how we could think and what possibilities I can see if we force ourselves, or if we are forced to think differently, making the impossible possible, which is actually the responsibility of politics together with other sectors in society. But during the pandemic, we heard that what was on the table was the Green Deal. We heard a lot of voices that should be paused or stopped, talking about reaction, being very reactive, focusing, the voices said we should focus on jobs and economy instead, as if that should be something else. It was the way we have constructed the society. But that's a very short-term perspective. That's panicking and wanting to see, we wanted to see stimulus to stimulate the economy without telling or reflecting or having an idea or deciding in what direction we should go in the longer term. And we did not only pause, that's my view, we also, the risk was severe that we should make things even worse. And that has also been the consequence when it comes to other crises, the financial crisis, when it comes to emissions that were a lot higher after or during the financial crisis. And what happened was that a lot of stimulus measures was put in place without having climate or environmental integrity or environmental concerns in focus. And meanwhile, we talked a lot about build back better. So we saw the opportunities, as you have all been speaking about. We saw the opportunities, we had the opportunities, but to be very risking being very pessimistic, I think we missed the opportunity again during the pandemic. And another obstacles that needs to be mentioned is that not only the one focusing on jobs and economy as something not connected to environmental or climate issues, but only technical solutions and fuels, and instead of focusing on behavior and community planning or societal planning. And to act in crisis and change things and change the direction, I think we need to decide very consciously on a set of principles. And the first one, I think, is that climate and environmental targets should and must be in focus. Stimulus measures should not be allowed to make things worse. They should and must be constructed in a way to speed up. They need to be constructed in a way that they speed up transition of the whole of society, because there were a lot of money that we spent in the EU and nationally in Sweden without focusing on the transition, which was the actual big crisis that we had to handle. Number two, that all politics need to be climate politics. That means having a holistic view when we do politics. The third one is control the capital. The money needs to be efficient for the transition and promote sustainability in a long-term perspective. And if we don't do this, we will make us even more dependent on fossil fuels in the future, exploring natural resources, and a very high consumption, which is not sustainable. The fourth one is set conditions. It's not, I mean, I don't think taxpayers should give away a lot of millions and billions of subsidies without conditions. And the conditions need to be cutting the emissions and to go from fossil to renewables and sustainability. I mean, you can set those conditions when you have a lot of money and the economy is very much going down. And the fifth one that I would like to mention is that the transition needs to be inclusive. And you have all been talking about all those positive things that happened during the pandemic. We saw a lot of good and positive things during that period, from business, from organizations, from individuals, that showed a lot of solidarity and wanting to contribute. And that is, of course, absolutely fundamental for a society to manage, go through and come out of the crisis. So therefore, politics should make it easier to make sustainable choices and to contribute, so that state subsidies should be go to organizations and business that produce and develop sustainable solutions. And that could be when it comes to innovation, innovative solutions, technical solutions, sustainable business and infrastructure that is sustainable, sharing, secondhand, repairing, renting. Those are all examples of circular solutions. And they're also often driven by small enterprises, organizations, non-profit organizations, in civil society, and with the idea of and force to contribute. And I would like to end, even though I've been very more pessimistic than you have been, on that positive note, and not only focus. We should not only focus on politics. We need to focus on a lot wider range of actors to be able to make the impossible possible. We're not only focusing on politics. We need to go all sectors within the society in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. And I remember those, like in the beginning of the pandemic, at least in Sweden, there was really this almost like a big feeling of possibilities, and everyone was we're talking about that. And and just you describe the missed opportunity. What could we have done differently? What do you think?
I think we could have, if we had been more, well, one thing is the Green movement or the Green Party or the transition movement would have been stronger represented in the parliament and in the government. We could have more power to set those conditions. If we had set those conditions, all those money that we spent could have been efficient for the transition, I think. So that was really a missed opportunity. So we could, I mean, we saw all those possibilities and creative solutions. And if we had taken them into the work for political reforms, that could have made all the difference, of course. But maybe we need to, when we talk about pandemic as the crisis, and you, Verena, mentioned geopolitical connections, the energy security connection. There might be a possibility that was not in the pandemic, that we see the European Commission behaving differently in the energy crisis than they did during the pandemic. So let's hope that we can learn and sometime use those crises for possibilities from politics.
Yeah, and you touch upon also the big issue of like, how do we gather more people, and how do we widen these discussions?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are possibilities there as well. And thank you so much, all of you wonderful speakers with so many interesting thoughts. And we have now 20 minutes left, and I would like to encourage everyone, all the attendees, to put forward questions in the Q&A. And I think we can really use this opportunity as a forum for dialogue. And I mean, you speakers can also put forward questions to the attendees or to one another.
I think you had some questions in the chat.
We could start off with one. At least, let's see if I have. Was one on resilience? So the question is, a clear parallel from the pandemic with the current geopolitical stability is the matter of resilience. Does each one of you have any example of a shift during the pandemic that could now improve resilience in the face of war, energy crisis, and the cost of living and inflation? Eva.
I need to get a better reputation of only being pessimistic. So I can say that I saw a lot of opportunities when it comes to infrastructure or transporting. A lot of people changed their way of transporting. I mean, digitalization is one thing, not as a sitting and being transported, but I think a lot of people started going by bicycle or walking. I think also, but we don't do that anymore. That's very sad, because we started washing our hands, and that's not only good for the pandemic or the virus that was right then. We should do that. But I mean, how many of us wash our hands the way we did during the worst phase of the pandemic? Not very many, I think. But I mean, I think many also experienced very positive consequences of. I mean, I walked to work, and it was really, you could have meetings during your walk, or you could listen to podcasts or radio or whatever, news, walking 1 hour. I mean, that was a change of experiences and change of mindset. And I thought I will continue to do this, but I haven't.
Anyone more?
I was just wanted to say, I'm going to be annoyingly optimistic again, in that there are many ways in which we see things defaulting back to how they were before. But I think there's also lots of ways in which the changes we experienced have been sticky, have stayed with us. I think we've seen a permanent and decisive shift in working patterns, in people working more flexibly, working from home, commuting less, traveling less in that way. I think we will probably see a lasting shift in the way that people do take their vacations. Yes, there is something of a bounce back in terms of those people who really like flying around the world for their long haul holidays, but I think it's opened up opportunities for people. I also wanted to say that I think at the very local level, there's been a huge range of different responses. I mean, I live in big metropolis of London, and each of the boroughs in London are very different, and some of them have worked hard to try and hold on to some of those urban redesigns to make active travel easier, whereas others have, finished pilot schemes before they've even finished, if you see what I mean. So I think there's been a very different picture, but I think it has opened up opportunities. I suppose it was inevitable that there would be a swing of the pendulum back to how things were for many people, but I do think it's staying around. The one additional thing I was just going to mention, because today we're talking about consumption and we're talking about consumerism, and it's an issue that Anna and I have been working on together, in fact, and that's the way in which the choices we make are made from the choices which are made readily available to us. And one of the issues that we're working on at the moment is around advertising, and the advertising of high carbon products, lifestyles and choices. And so some things which are beginning to be introduced, I know there is action in Sweden, there is some action in the UK as well, and in some other EU countries, about trying to do for the promotion of types of consumption which are most damaging to the climate, being treated like tobacco advertising and cigarette advertising, and so that we remove those prompts and the normalization of those high carbon activities from our local environment. So there we are. I think I just wanted to say that I think we can look around and see that changes of behavior, changes of activity, experiments around shorter working weeks and basic income schemes, that these have all been accelerated by the experience of the pandemic. And to answer Eva's question very, very specifically, I think I wash my hands more now than I did before the pandemic. Whether it's as much as at the height of the pandemic, I'm not sure, but I definitely wash them more than I used to.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else want to talk about? No, but
yeah, I have something associated with Andrew and also Eva. I could also see that there are some behaviors, and also that we re-explored the local environment where we lived during the pandemic, at least where we could, I guess. And we can see that also now in local politics where I live, where people really want to keep the green areas that are in place, but whereas the long gone city planning has something else in plan, and how the conflict between newly explored what we have around the corner with politics and decisions made ages ago and plans made ages ago, where there might not have been such an awareness of or usage or what we had just around the corner. So I think that's quite interesting to see how our systems were accustomed for an area that we did have a few years ago, but maybe not is valid anymore, or it should be at least renegotiated.
Yeah, thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I think I side with Andrew here. Like I've been mostly inspired by the reactions by people, the strength of communities, the commons, and less by policy reactions, on which side I think I'm on the line with Ms. Svedling. So I've seen in Belgium on both crises, pandemic and energy, a move of a general public suddenly discovering community-owned production locally. In the first instance with the pandemic, with community-supported agriculture projects, I'm 15 years already in such a farm. We are 500 people, 3 farmers, and we go and harvest at the farm. Suddenly in the pandemic, people were like, oh, okay, local food production, that might be an interesting thing. And the demand was huge, and like local supply chain was suddenly interesting. Same now with energy crisis. The cheapest energy provider in the whole country of Belgium is a cooperative of people who are making 100% wind energy only for the last decades. And suddenly everyone wants to join, but they can't allow everyone to join because then they would need to buy on the market and they can't build the windmill in 1 week. So the issue of permits for windmills became a different issue. Like, you want cheap energy? Fine, then give the permits for the windmill. So these are promising shifts, I would say, mostly at the level of citizens getting organized, already working on niche solutions. And during the crisis, a lot of people finding them like, oh, these guys, they seem to know what they're doing. If only we had joined them earlier. So that was for me the most, wow, okay, common shift in these 2 crises, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And Verena, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I think most things have already been said. I mean, I can only reiterate what Nick just said about the well, everyone wanting to join now the 100% renewables community, while of course everyone who's done it before, even going into this crisis, is now profiting, let's say, of it, or also other, let's say, communities that are sharing energy or have already tried to find alternative ways before. I mean, yeah. So.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. If you were elected leader of your country, what is the one policy that you would immediately introduce to help address these intertwined crises, and why? Very good question.
I can jump in on this one because I answered it in type already, so I know what my answer is. I said I would introduce a shorter working week, which is underpinned by a form of universal basic income and access to universal basic services, because that frees people up to become the agents of the transition, and it reduces the pressure for consumption. It breaks the hedonic treadmill, the work earning consumption treadmill. So that will be my answer.
Thank you. Anyone more?
I vote for that.
You vote for that? Yes.
Totally agree.
We're
also producing the next report on exactly that topic again, Andrew. So yes, totally agree. I can maybe add, I also replied in the comments already, like, the first thing I would do is get my country out of the Energy Charter Treaty, because these are the handcuffs that tie every country into fossil fuel lock-ins. And now suddenly in this crisis, one country by the next, France, the Netherlands, are following the lead of Italy, and they're stopping membership because it allows them to then earlier close down fossil fuel projects, and they weren't allowed to do that because they would be fined for billions. So that's the first thing, to free us from the governments, from the handcuffs that they are having through all these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms in various trade deals. But the ECT, the Energy Charter Treaty, is like this old fossil trade treaty that's really the worst. It's maybe obscure, not little known, but it's a massive lock-in in the fossil fuel. And then you can talk about, here's a plan for 10 years of fossil fuel phase out, in which we're going to help everyone who would suffer most from that. And then there's no longer going to be extraction, production, or sale of fossil fuels in our country from 10 years from now. And here's, like, let's talk how to make it happen and get serious. And not focus on the consumption side, but focus on because once the oil is out of the ground, it's already too late anyway. So we need a non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels. And actually, some people are discussing this.
Yeah, maybe I can add on directly, coming from the fossil fuels, of course, to what are the solutions to it. I think it would make sense to align policies with the Paris Agreement goal to really make sure that we're embarking on a safer pathway. And in that regard, yeah, I mean, tackling the permitting issues on renewable and with regards to renewable energy, looking at energy savings really in a long-term perspective, and yeah, making sure that in the sum, yeah, the greenhouse gas emissions are being kept under control or low. And I think that would already bring us towards a safer future and tackle at least the one long-lasting climate crisis. And of course, this is also intertwined with the energy crisis, COVID in the end too. And in the end, I would also be in favor of a shorter working week, of course. But yeah, maybe we can work together on that end.
Thank you, Verena. And Eva, I mean, you have almost been, you've not been working for the, well, you were not prime minister yourself, but you worked for the vice prime minister. So maybe you have some perspectives on what's the one thing to do.
I think I can say two things. I totally agree with you when it comes to shorter working week, because I think that's one thing is lowering the emission, changing the society, changing the consumption habits. But I also think that you're really pointing out the most important thing is making it possible for people to be actors of change themselves, and that takes time. And we need to, what we experienced during the pandemic was time, and to rethink and reorganize and experience things that we hadn't had time to do. I think that's really the most progressive reform. But I would also put investments in climate when it comes to infrastructure and sustainability outside the ordinary budget, and really put a lot of money to make them efficient in the transition as a reform. If I was a prime minister, which I wasn't.
Thank you. And I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I really agree with you that, yeah, the perspective of time was really something astonishing. Like it influenced everyone, and of course, some people were working very, very hard. So they had like, but for people like me, it gave a lot of space. But just to end this very interesting and fascinating conversation, I'd just like to ask, what will you bring from this conversation in your upcoming, I don't know, conversations and events? Anyone?
It's a really good question. I think the thing I'll take from this conversation is a confirmation of not just the possibilities. I mean, obviously, we're in this incredibly precarious situation where things do seem dire, and you can wake up one morning and look at the trends and the statistics and think that everything is awful. And you can wake up the next morning and see evidence of change and the sort of latent possibilities and think that they're incredible. I'll take from this conversation a great deal of comfort that the awareness of the possibilities, the beneficial, life-enhancing, life-supporting changes which can meet multiple economic, social, and ecological challenges are well embedded, well understood, that there are many examples of them, and that at the moment, the missing link is the countervailing political force to see it happen. I think we're in the dying days of the kind of the growth obsessed narrative, and sitting here in the UK, even though we still do have sort of a tenacious form of government, the wilder end of the neoliberal experiment not only crashed and burned in the most extraordinary way very, very quickly. And I think that was a salutary lesson for people. But I think much as when we didn't see the end of the Cold War until it actually happened. We didn't see the wall coming down until it actually happened. That before that time, there was a hollowing out of a system that led to the possibility for a rapid change. Now, in terms of economics and the economics underpinning our consumption patterns, I think that is happened too now. I think there's been a hollowing out of the old intellectual over self-confidence of neoliberalism and that growth, consumption-based model, and that everything else is primed and ready to take over. And I think the practical examples of the possibilities of doing things differently that we've witnessed during the pandemic still leave me ridiculously hopeful, regardless of everything.
Thank you, Andrew. And I also would like to say to all you participants and attendees that you can also write in the chat, or I don't know which format is the best, what you will bring with you. And who next? Verena, would you like to say a few words?
What I take from this webinar is mainly, as Nick already said, we are looking a lot at being reactive to what's happening on the policy arena. And I take from this webinar to be a bit more proactive, let's say, in that sense. And reacting maybe a bit less, also inspired by what Eva has been telling us about her pessimist viewpoints. And I think to really be able to be also positive and optimist about the future, we need to think out of the box and go beyond pure reaction and trying to adapt small things, but really thinking in the bigger picture.
Thank you. Who next? Katarina?
Yeah, I think also I bring the perspectives and learnings from everybody, both on the opportunities and missed opportunities. And also I think that we live in a time with a series of crises and earthquakes, or whatever we want to call them. And I think that will provide new opportunities that we maybe can catch this time or next time, and that we actually have, as a society or a global society, a collective experience of something where we probably have learned a lot that we could apply in the near future with these crises coming up and the opportunities that we have with them.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, but I think we can take 1 or 2 minutes past, don't you think, to have your last ones. Nick, what do you have? What will you bring?
Well, I share a lot of the feeling of resilience by people and communities reacting to crisis. I think that's a common thread in the debate, while sharing also a bit like missed opportunity feeling on the political level. But again, it's maybe this is indeed like the prequel to a big political shift as well, and like indeed trust government was a spectacular example of like, this model, you can try it one more time. Well, actually, it's failing even on the merits of the actual model itself, the markets. So we're really at a turning point in that sense on the macroeconomical level. I just come from a meeting from the European Parliament with 5 political groups, 20 MEPs organizing a massive Beyond Growth conference, 15, 16, 17 May next year. And all the political players in Europe are already like involved, committed. So I think opportunity is there. So while political shift hasn't already taken place, a lot of things are already in place. A lot of good people, good thinking already exists even in the institutions. And maybe suddenly a Berlin Wall movement can happen at the arrival of the next crisis. And that's why I still keep working and being hopeful, stubbornly hopeful.
Thank you. Eva?
I think thank you very much for very inspiring discussions. And I think we need to invent more meeting places and more discussions. And we cannot wait for governments to have all the solutions. We need to, I think we need to be in dialogue with them. We need to help them. We need to be constructive, but we also need to act ourselves and to reconstruct and strengthen democracy in a way, to take action from all sectors of society. I think that's really, really important. That's also very easy. We see that now in Sweden. You know what I'm talking about. In the Swedish politics, we see the government being very conservative and the opposition. The government say one thing and the opposition the total different. Then you have this debate that it's not leading anywhere. I mean, it's not being constructive. We need to get in touch and listen and find new solutions and new meeting places to be able to cope with this very demanding situation, I think.
Thank you so much, and a very good way of ending up with meetings. And let's meet further, let's see each other more, and let's just keep on being in touch. And you can always look out for the Rapid Transition Alliance, and in Sweden, we're with Sweden, and there's so many other organizations as well. So just thank you so much to all the ones that have been listening, and wonderful speakers. And yeah, see you in another meeting. Well, another meeting is the 3rd of November. We'll have another webinar like this with focus on transports. So if you're keen on discussing that, then you're very, very welcome. And we can also create new meetings, as you say, Eva. Thank you.